The U.S. Embassy in Riyadh has warned of a possible strike on Riyadh amid intensifying Yemeni retaliatory attacks against Saudi Arabia. In a statement, the embassy said it is tracking reports of missiles or drones that may be headed toward Riyadh. It warned American citizens in the capital to stay alert and take necessary precautions. Yemeni forces have in the past announced attacks against strategic positions in the Saudi capital in response to the Saudi war on Yemen. The Yemeni army says it has targeted several positions in southern Saudi Arabia this week, but Riyadh claims drone and missile attacks have been intercepted. Now, Yemeni forces say the attacks will continue until Riyadh stops its war. Saudi war began over 5 years back, killing tens of thousands of Yemenis, many of them civilians. And now joining us for this news review is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from Bristol, and Yusuf Mowry, journalist and commentator, joining us from Detroit, Michigan, out of the States. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. I guess we'll start here in Bristol and then head west. Tony, great to see you again. Hope you're doing well. Your thoughts on this warning being issued to keep your eyes open. There may be a retaliatory attack coming from the Yemenis.
Well, it's about time, really, because the Yemenis' crime seems to be fighting back. This war has got to be an only one-sided war where missiles and airstrikes come in and artillery strikes come in to Yemen, but nothing is allowed to go back to Saudi Arabia. I mean, the actual coverage of this war I found appalling here in the West. As a long time, for 30 years, a journalist myself, back in the first Gulf War, when I first started in the BBC years ago, we had actually pretty good coverage of that first Gulf War. We had veteran reporters explaining the context and the background of everything, particularly the history of the region. What we haven't had is that anywhere in the Western world on Yemen. We had President Hadi, who was installed as a puppet president in 2012 by the West, with the help of the West, as has happened in many, many other countries. But the people weren't having it in Yemen, and they dared to fight back. By 2014, the people had decided they were absolutely adamant they wanted this puppet president, and we had a civil war going. So for about a year that raged, and then in March 2015, the Saudis weighed in and started to support this puppet president. So I would argue that although everywhere in the West you hear about this as a Saudi-led war, and they're quite okay about saying that the Saudis appear to be winning the aggressors and this sort of thing, what they won't tell you is actually no, it's a US, Israeli, NATO-led war with the Saudis effectively propping up President Hadi, amazingly still around, even though he's got virtually zero credibility in Yemen itself, but who was put in place by the US, the Israelis and NATO. So this is a proxy war, another proxy war. The Saudis are basically the fall guys, the cover story for another Western expansionism, the sort of thing we've seen going on, of course, in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, these other countries, Afghanistan. But here in Yemen, there's been very little proper analysis. The figures are pretty staggering. Even the United Nations says there's 250,000 people in Yemen now being killed in this conflict. And I can tell you, a friend of mine is an old soldier who was in the 1960s part of the British Army when the British Army were kicked out of Yemen by the Marxist government at the time. And there were scores of people, something like 20, 30 people killed in that conflict. And the British then moved out. Now we're seeing a much, much bigger and a utterly horrific conflict, now in 2017, 2020, with 250,000 innocent people killed in the poorest country in the Middle East. So this is how horrific this is, and it's not getting any proper coverage here at all. So, of course, the Yemeni people need to have the right to fight back against the Saudis and against their sponsors, in the West.
Thank you, Tony. And hello, Yusuf. Hope you're doing well. Good to have you back on Press TV. Your initial thoughts on this?
I believe the U.S. is genuinely concerned about their biggest ally in the region, Saudi Arabia. The U.S. Government, they realize that Ansar Allah, the Houthis, they have the military capability to deliver devastating blows to their buddy in the Middle East. So they're giving this warning to Saudi Arabia, or they're advising Saudi Arabia to take notice. It turns out that Ansar Allah, they actually have military capability. They have ballistic missiles. They have drones. And the U.S. is telling Saudi Arabia, be careful, because Ansar Allah has that capability to launch such attacks. And we've seen this throughout the war. Ansar Allah has targeted Saudi airports. They've targeted Saudi military bases in the southern regions. They've targeted Aramco, Saudi Arabia's most precious jewel. So as the blockade continues and as Saudi Arabia continues to carry out this bombardment across Yemen, Ansar Allah has warned that these military activities will only escalate. And they're promising to use state-of-the-art military capability that Saudi Arabia has not yet witnessed in the war. They're actually threatening to target deep into the Saudi capital, and Ansar Allah is threatening to target commercial airports, because they feel that if Saudi Arabia can target civilian airports in Yemen, then they should perhaps return the favor. And if Yemenis that are outside of Yemen, if people can't travel in and out of Yemen, then Ansar Allah would like nothing more than to return that favor and destroy Saudi in a way to declare war on Saudi Arabia's economy. So it's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Ansar Allah is stepping up their military activities, and they're doing so by launching countless drone strikes and sophisticated ballistic missiles.
All right, thank you. And Tony, at this point, is it fair to say, and you kind of alluded to this, that, really the Saudis, even if they were to get the upper hand, how can they successfully, after 5 years of bombing this country into submission, after all the endless civilian infrastructure that was bombed and civilians were killed, and the embargoes and the blockade on their ports, not to get invaluable food and medicine, especially throughout this pandemic, how does Riyadh think that it could ultimately install a puppet government that will be accepted in Sana'a?
Well, look, in the Pentagon, this would be described as a crash and burn scenario. The answer is they can't sustain it. Now, look, the people they're fighting, the Houthis, who are the most popular group in Yemen, definitely represent most of the people in the country and should really be forming the government. Have a look at who they're fighting. They're fighting Al-Qaeda. They've been fighting ISIS. They're also fighting Blackwater, that is XE or Academy, Eric Prince's private army, which is basically a kind of privatized version of the Pentagon. They're also been fighting MKO, which is the terrorist group which has killed something like 10,000 people in Iran, sponsored by the United States and the CIA and the American intelligence services, and actually supported by the French intelligence services. So that's who the Houthis are fighting. It's a kind of a ragtag army of every kind of proxy fake force that NATO and the Americans have been able to put together to destabilize the region. They're all fighting what should be the legitimate government. But then there's a parallel escalation, I think, here in Europe. And that is what we've seen with the enormous escalation of the lockdowns in Germany and France, where the people have been told they've got to have permission to leave their houses. In Wales and Scotland, the powerful lockdowns that have been put here with those regional governments that really supported the Remain position and support Brussels and the EU. They're not really loyal to Westminster. And also in the northern region of Britain. In these places, people are not allowed to come out and demonstrate. And if they do, they face massive fines and arrests. So I think this is like the home front in Europe, where when populations see their governments instituting horrific foreign policy decisions, like the way things are going in Yemen and the attacks on Yemen, as they escalate, people want to come out and demonstrate, and they're being told in Europe, no, you're not allowed to. And I think that's actually part of the same struggle that's going on by the Houthis, is that you've got domestic populations also attempting anyway to be crushed by governments here in Europe.
Thank you, Tony. Always a pleasure to have you on. And that's a wrap for this segment of your PressTV News Review, everyone. That was Tony Gosling joining us from Bristol, and Yusuf Mowry joining us out of Detroit. And that's a wrap for this segment. Thanks for tuning in, and bye-bye for now.